Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare information, shall we say. This one might not be for everybody, but we'll find out. You, of course, can ask us a question, as Seanbob, one of our patrons, has asked, and you can see that if it's at all possible to answer, we will try. And as you know, you can ask us a question on Facebook. You can ask us a question via Messenger. You can send us one through Patreon as well. You can even ask one in a comment on one of the others. And of course, on Patreon, www.patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast, you can back us at one of three different levels if you enjoy the podcast. Now, today's question, excuse my French, my question is, what is up with foreskin collection? Shocking. I know Ramses wrote on walls about the stacks of foreskins he's collected from the Sea Peoples, and David bought his wife with foreskins in the book of Samuel. Indeed. So I have more appropriately labeled this one to deal with battlefield trophies. And yes, indeed, we think that either phalluses or foreskins are part of that collection, but there's a whole bunch of others as well. And very interestingly, they fall into a whole different series of categories. The first one seems to be proof of death, that you've killed and taken the life that you said you can, and there's a whole system of rewards, and lots of Egyptian and other sources talk about the taking of hands, specifically right hands, rather than necessarily both hands. We also have the idea of trophies, both in terms of displaying them on the battlefield, which we've talked about before, but also in terms of taking them home and displaying them on your saddle, belt, outside your camp, those sorts of things. There's also the idea of humiliation of an enemy. And in addition, there seems to be mutilation of an enemy as part of a propaganda war, but also perhaps as part of a war crime. There does seem to be some evidence in various ancient texts that this kind of thing happened against norms of warfare, that you don't do even thinking back to Achilles and Hector, the dragging of his body around Troy was a war crime, was regarded as bad rather than just what happens in war. And certainly with the Assyrians, they seem to gloat and deal with the mutilation of enemy bodies in a way that most other cultures really didn't approve of. There's also, unfortunately, with more modern versions, certain racism and racist science that's gone on with the collection of body parts, but that's well beyond and outside of the realm of ancient warfare. Now, taking hands, we've got Egyptian and Near Eastern warfare as a sort of a way of proving a head count or claiming responsibility. Fascinatingly, some of them are only single hands that they claim, as opposed to piles of hands, which we see on several reliefs. You also get the head count literally, and it's in the phrase of heads to prove that you've killed certain people. And of course, a head, there's no surviving it, as opposed to you could survive losing your right hand. You don't really survive a head count. It's also proof that you've got the person you're meant to have got. So that's certainly part of it. Decebalus on Trajan's column is one such example, of course, that the head of Decebalus is paraded in front of the soldiers on a shield. We see that in scene 147 near the top of Trajan's column. We also have this not only from reliefs and literary texts, but we also have some archaeological finds which back this up, especially at Avaris in Egypt, that one of the expeditions uncovered 16 right hand only. And of course, we have the tomb of Armosa at El Kab, which talks about taking hands and presenting them as a reward, presenting them for a reward. When we get to the third fighting against the Canaanites at Megiddo, one of his stelae recording the victory talks about the plunder that had been carried off, the hands, the prisoners of war, horses, golden chariots. So hands are clearly something that, generally speaking, you would take from the dead as proof that they had been killed. We also, of course, have right hands being piled into a heap. We see some images of victors chopping off hands in order to present to the king as examples of their success. Now, that custom seems to have been quite widespread. I have read some people saying it didn't exist outside of Egypt. And for instance, the Hyksos, who seem to have done it at Avaris, had learned it in Egypt. That doesn't seem to be the case. We have examples, for instance, in the book of Judges. Gideon asks for supplies from the town of Succoth and is basically given the reply, "Are our hands already in yours?" Which has lots of commentary on what that might particularly mean. But if it means the same thing as this taking of right hands, are our hands already in your hands? It could well be, have you chopped our hands off already? And we've also got Ugarit tablets from much further north, around 1200 BC, and we talk about the mythical narrative of Anat, who has under her are heads like balls, above her are hands like locusts. Heaps of fighters' hands are like heaps of grasshoppers. So again, the idea of taking a fighter's hand is a proof that they've been killed. So you've got the idea of taking hands in a Near Eastern context, stretching from Ugarit all the way down to Egypt. Taking heads seems to be far more widespread. You've got taking heads in Near Eastern warfare, Egyptian warfare, Mesoamerican, Dacian, Scythian. We've got several cultures which like skull cups. And of course, in more recent, you've got headhunters, obviously, scalping, things like that. So that's continued in various areas. In the Amazon, you've got headhunters and Oceania and other places. Now, you wear them perhaps to scare your enemies and as a sort of an intimidation, but also as a sort of a showing of who you've killed. But there's also a ritualistic aspect to it of taking the power of the person. That's in skull cups. But there's also a bit of humiliation that you get. I rewatched A Few Good Men. That even continues as a humiliation and a mutilation today in popular culture. Now, we also get, the story of David cutting Goliath's head off, and he takes it back to show that he has killed, and he's not just bragging of killing Goliath. So that's also in the Near East as well. We find Neo-Assyrian kings talking about, I felled 800 of their troops and cut off their heads. Then, of course, in the Neo-Assyrian context, they hung their heads on trees around the city as a way of humiliating them in death and the living from their culture. That idea of cutting off the head and placing it, we still get that idea on for a long, long time into the 19th century, even of portraying traitors' bodies, parts at various different things, and heads on pikes and things like that. So that still happens. We see that on Trajan's column. So we see the auxiliary cavalry on Trajan's column taking heads, bringing them back to Trajan to show who it was that they had killed and that they had killed who they said they had. We also get one image of an auxiliary cavalryman or an auxiliary infantryman holding a decapitated head's hair in his teeth as he continues combat to gain more. And of course, you also find that heads are displayed on pikes outside of Roman fortifications on that column as well. We find from Diodorus and Strabo that the Celts were very, very fond of hanging decapitated heads from their saddles. And that is, that's also part of it. We have decapitation as a punishment, so possibly reserved for traitors and rebels in civil war. But there are other parts as well. We have several bits of evidence of ears, teeth, noses. Again, a medieval context, the Japanese invasion of Korea, ears and noses were collected. We have noses as proofs of kills. And again, in Vietnam, more recently, again, ears. But that's also not only proof of people you killed, just like notches in a gun, but it's a humiliation and a grisly ritual as well. But also, that goes back to proof of kill. We find again in the book of Judges that we get the amputation of thumbs and big toes, and that could also be retribution if they've done the same thing to you. So it's that as well, and there's also some decapitation in the book of Samuel and the book of Kings. Now, getting back to Samuel's foreskins to finish with, we've got the idea that, this is a bride price. So the story is that Samuel asks David for 100 Philistine foreskins as the bride price for his daughter. And David goes off and kills 200 Philistines and brings 200 foreskins back. Now, this also is possibly intended as a trap, that the reason Saul is sending David to fight the Philistines is for the Philistines to kill him. And by asking for 100, surely they're going to kill him. And of course, the point that he brings 200 back means he doesn't die. In Josephus's version of that, in the Jewish antiquities, it's 600 heads that are demanded rather than foreskins. And so you get this idea that it's actually a trap, but it's also in humiliation, because it's intended to make the Philistines hate David because he's mutilated the bodies of their men. But we know, again, from several scenes, from Medinet Habu, for instance, the mortuary temple of Ramses III, that there are representations not only of hands, but also of phalluses, which could possibly be the same idea of foreskins. We've also got a representation of tongues, a tongue count. So, you've got that idea of, as I said at the start, the idea is that it's a combination of a head count, a trophy, humiliation, mutilation, and various other bits, some of which are accepted in some cultures and some of which are not. But the major part of that seems to be a proof that you've killed who you've said you've killed, and are claiming the reward for being taken lives of your enemies. So thank you. Hopefully that was informative and not disgusting. And we will see you again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks.